Hi, everyone. My name is Guneet, and we are talking on Canem Network with Adam Zivo. We are in Vancouver here, which is not too far away in downtown from the East Hastings Street, the center focus of this issue about the drugs. So Adam has just conducted a polling about the effects of drugs and its relation with racism. Thank you, Adam, for talking to us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. So, to provide context, harm reduction activists often claim that we must legalize drugs for the sake of anti racism and Indigenous reconciliation. They fundamentally claim that it is racist to criminalize drugs. However, in my drug reporting, I've often heard from community members that this is not true and that minority communities are very anti drug and oppose laissez faire addiction policies. However, these stories that I heard were fundamentally anecdotal. And so a month ago, I commissioned Main Street Polling to add a few questions to their BC Daily tracking election poll regarding racism and drug policy. I wanted to see whether the data would validate what I was hearing on the ground, and it did. So from that poll, we released the preliminary data, which had 6,300 respondents, and we found that of non-white British Columbians, 26% believed that it was racist to criminalize drugs, which is a minority, but more than half, 55%, said that it was not racist. On top of that, while those who somewhat agreed that it was racist to, criminalize drugs and who somewhat disagreed, that was a fairly equal split at around 10 to 15%. But the people who disagreed with it, that it was racist, were much more vehement in their beliefs. So I think about 45% of them said that it was not, like they strongly disagreed that this was racist, whereas only about 10 to 13% strongly agreed. So what we're seeing here is a very clear story, which is that minority communities in BC do not believe that it's racist to criminalize drugs. Now, the sample size for non-white Canadians in this poll was about 1,000, which gives a margin of error of plus minus 3%. So this is a sample size which is very normal in polling, and it's a trustworthy number. And the gap that we saw, between the 26 and 55% is so large that this margin of error can't possibly confound it, so we can be very confident in our results. However, if you're looking at specific ethnic groups, the results are a bit more questionable. We're not fully confident in them because the sample sizes are smaller. However, we did have sufficient sample sizes to show that Native Canadians, Indigenous Canadians, overwhelmingly do not support laissez-faire drug policies. So of First Nations respondents, only 17% said that it was racist to criminalize drugs, whereas an overwhelming 68% said it was not racist. So we're looking at a 51-point divide. That's overwhelming. And that's with a sample size of about 170, with a margin of error of plus minus 7%. Now, that margin of error is relatively large, but nowhere near large enough to account for such a dramatic difference in opinion. Why does this matter? Well, when you look at our leading addiction policymakers in Canada, in Health Canada and in BC, we see this narrative of anti-racism being used again and again to push for absurd drug policies that enable addiction and normalize it in public spaces. Just in the summer, BC's top doctor, Bonnie Henry, released a report calling for the legalization of all drugs because she said that criminalization was rooted in colonialism, white supremacy, and human rights violations. Well, how can she say that if the minority communities that she's claiming to advocate for, that she's claiming to represent, strongly disagree with her? And I think that the gap between the polling data and some of our leading addiction policymakers suggests that there are underlying problems with how our institutions conceptualize consultation with minority communities. They often seem to rely on a small clique of activists and ideological researchers who may not represent the full spectrum of beliefs of the communities that they claim to represent. And I think that when we look at this, there's a clear case to be made for more investment into more polling of minority communities in BC and other parts of Canada to get a more accurate sense of what they actually believe so that we can ensure that our addiction policies properly represent the interests of all Canadians, regardless of their ethnicity. We need to make sure that we're actually listening to minority communities and not simply allowing them to be exploited to push a radical agenda which they do not support.
One of the things that we consider right now with the drug, especially in here in BC, is that the BC is undergoing elections. So tomorrow is where the election is, and one of the campaigns on the conservative side is to stop the drugs and have a drastic change on the drug policy. What do you have to say to the British Columbians who are going in and trying to see if they want to support what NDP has offered or they want to change?
Well, I think that anyone who supports public safety and supports rational drug laws should support the BC Conservatives. The BC NDP have had several years to figure this out, and they've evidently failed. Under their government, overdose rates and deaths have only skyrocketed, and public safety has only disappeared. And I think that there is a clear mismatch between the policies endorsed by the BC NDP and non-white British Columbians. And I think that that is reflected in the polling data that we have so far. So Main Street Research, which is the polling company that I work with, has shown that though the BC NDP has a slight advantage amongst white British Columbian voters, an advantage of approximately 1% to 2% the last time I checked, that non-white voters support the BC Conservatives by a very large margin of about 11 to 12 points. And I think that given how drug policy has been so integral to this election, you can interpret this polling as suggesting that non-white, so minority British Columbians are defecting to the Conservatives en masse because they are fed up with some of the ill-advised crime and addiction policies that they are seeing around them.
Do you think that this ideological marriage that the NDP's drug policy and the czars of the drug policy in the British Columbia has really hurt the British Columbians, and would that be a lesson in coming future?
I think yes. I think that the BC NDP's mismanagement of the opioid crisis has been catastrophic, and it's cost us thousands of lives. We have to keep in mind that the addiction crisis, the opioid crisis, is killing thousands of people every single year. It is the leading cause of death for youth now. And when you have a government that is so married to evidence-free policies like safe supply, policies that only make the problem worse, because they have some, myth in their head that if you just make drugs widely available and legal, then all the problems will disappear. I think that that's unhealthy, and I think that that's destructive. And I really hope that British Columbians will make the right choice this election and penalize the BC NDP for their ill-advised and destructive drug policies.
Thank you for talking with us on this issue, on such an important issue.
Thanks for having me on the show.